There's a secret that spiritual teachers rarely share, a truth that gets glossed over in all those shiny Instagram posts about awakening and enlightenment. The moment you truly awaken, everything you thought you wanted suddenly feels empty. Not broken, not wrong, just quiet. Like your soul pressed mute on the world and it forgot to turn the sound back on. Have you ever noticed how the most profound spiritual experiences are followed by the strangest psychological emptiness? You achieve the breakthrough you've been seeking for years. You finally see through the illusion. You touch that place of infinite peace and understanding. And then you come back to ordinary reality, feeling like you're moving through water. Maybe it happened after a major spiritual insight during meditation, or perhaps following a personal breakdown that cracked you open completely. You might have experienced it during a period of intense grief that stripped away all your usual defenses. Or maybe it came through plant medicine therapy, or simply a moment of grace that arrived uninvited. However it happened, you felt something fundamental shift deep inside. You saw through the illusion, recognized the patterns that had been running your life, heard past the mental noise, and then silence. Before we dive deeper, if this resonates with your soul's journey, please hit that like button and subscribe for more transformational content. Your support helps this message reach other souls who need to hear it. At first, it felt powerful, even empowering. You thought you had finally found the answer, the key, the secret that everyone was searching for, but few actually discovered. There was this sense of having graduated from some cosmic university, of having earned a degree in reality that most people would never receive. But slowly, quietly, that sense of meaning and purpose just began to vanish. Not overnight, not dramatically, but like water slowly draining from a bathtub. Your soul turned down the volume on life itself, and suddenly you found yourself asking the question that whispers louder each day: why do I feel so numb now that I finally see the truth? There's this peculiar quality to post-awakening numbness that's different from depression or regular sadness. It's not that you're in pain exactly. It's more like you're wrapped in invisible cotton, observing life from a distance that you can't quite bridge. The things that used to excite you, motivate you, drive you forward, they all seem somehow less real, less important, less compelling than they used to be. Here's the strange paradox, that no one prepared you for the twist that catches even experienced spiritual seekers completely off guard. We expect spiritual awakening to ignite our passion, to light us up from the inside, to make everything more vibrant, meaningful, and alive. We imagine it will be like someone finally turned the lights on in a room we've been stumbling through in the dark our entire lives. But for so many people, especially the deeply introspective types, the natural empaths, the lifelong seekers who have always felt things more deeply than others around them, awakening does the exact opposite. It empties us. It creates this weird psychological vacuum where motivation used to live. I remember talking to a friend who embodied everything we associate with spiritual awareness. She was super bright, deeply intuitive, naturally psychic, obsessed with all the right books and teachers. Eckhart Tolle, Alan Watts, Krishnamurti, Ram Dass. She had studied them all, not casually, but with the kind of devotion most people reserve for romantic relationships. Her bookshelves looked like a spiritual library. Her meditation practice was disciplined and consistent. Her understanding of non-dual philosophy was sophisticated and nuanced. Then she experienced what she described as a massive awakening following what she called her dark night of the soul, a period of intense depression and disillusionment that lasted for months, where every foundation of her identity seemed to crumble simultaneously. Her career lost meaning. Her relationships felt hollow. Her spiritual practices felt mechanical and empty. And then, like dawn breaking after the longest night, she got it. She finally understood what all those teachers had been pointing toward. She saw through the illusion of the separate self, understood the futility of chasing external validation, recognized the endless cycle of ego gratification that had been driving her entire adult life. She experienced what she called pure being. For the first time, a state of such profound peace and completion that she knew with absolute certainty that she would never be the same person again. And yet 2 months later, she was lying in bed at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, staring at her ceiling, barely able to summon the energy to shower or make food. She told me something that still echoes in my mind years later. I used to cry over not achieving enough, not being successful enough, not having the relationship I wanted. Now I don't care whether I do anything at all. I thought awakening would light me up like a Christmas tree, not leave me feeling like I'm watching life through bulletproof glass. She wasn't alone in this experience, and neither are you if this resonates with your own journey. There's something about genuine spiritual awakening that seems to temporarily short-circuit our normal motivational systems, leaving us floating in a kind of existential limbo that our culture has no framework for understanding or supporting. What's really happening in your psyche after awakening goes infinitely deeper than most people realize, deeper than most spiritual teachers acknowledge, and certainly deeper than our therapeutic culture is equipped to handle. You're not just experiencing a temporary motivation dip that a good pep talk or life coach could fix. You're not going through a phase that positive thinking or better morning routines can resolve. You are undergoing a complete system upgrade, a fundamental reprogramming of your entire psychological operating system. It's like your inner computer is installing a completely new OS, and during the installation process, none of your old programs work properly. The familiar applications keep crashing and the interface looks foreign, and you can't figure out where anything is located anymore. For most of your life, up until this point, your motivation came from one primary source: your ego identity, the me you thought you were. This ego self wanted to prove itself constantly, to be seen and recognized, to be successful, according to external measures, to be loved and accepted, to matter in some tangible way that other people would acknowledge and validate. This drive system isn't inherently bad or wrong or something to judge harshly. It's simply how human psychological development typically works in the first half of life. We need to build a strong sense of individual identity before we can transcend it. We need to develop our persona, what Jung called the mask we wear to function effectively in society, to get our basic needs met, to find our place in the world, and learn how to belong. But the awakening process does something quite radical to this carefully constructed identity structure. It doesn't just modify or improve the ego. It strips away the mask entirely. It reveals the ego to be a useful but ultimately limited tool rather than your true identity. Suddenly, you're not trying to be liked in the same desperate way. You're not trying to win the game because you can clearly see that the game itself is largely arbitrary, a collective agreement that most people follow unconsciously. Without the mask driving your choices, without the persona providing direction and motivation, your old goals literally don't fit anymore. They were custom-tailored to a version of you that no longer exists. It's like trying to wear clothes that belong to someone else, someone who looked similar to you, but had completely different proportions. Nothing fits right, and you can't figure out why you thought these clothes were so important in the first place. That's the real reason you feel unmotivated. You didn't lose your drive or passion or life force. You outgrew the entire fuel system that had been powering your choices and actions for decades. The old motivational engine has become obsolete, but the new one hasn't come online yet. You're in the gap between propulsion systems. Carl Jung believed that we're not here primarily to serve the ego's endless demands for validation, achievement, and security. We're here to integrate the ego, to align it with something infinitely larger and more meaningful than personal gratification. He called this lifelong process individuation, the journey of transforming from a fragmented, reactive, unconscious identity into a whole unified conscious self. Note that Jung used self with a capital S to distinguish it from the small self of ego identity. This larger self isn't just a bigger version of your personality. It's the soul-level center of your being, the part of you that connects directly to what mystics call the divine, what psychologists call the collective unconscious, what physicists might call the quantum field of infinite possibility. This capital S self doesn't care about status symbols or social media likes or climbing corporate ladders or even the kind of clarity and certainty that your mind desperately craves. The self is here to express truth through your unique human form, to live authentically regardless of external approval, to contribute something genuinely meaningful to the collective human experience. And the self operates by completely different principles than the ego ever did. Where the ego seeks to get, the self seeks to give. Where the ego tries to control outcomes, the self trusts the process. Where the ego fears not being enough, the self knows it's already complete. Where the ego accumulates experiences and achievements, the self expresses its essential nature through whatever form feels most authentic in each moment. Once awakening happens, once you've genuinely seen through the illusion of the separate self, your entire psyche begins this massive recalibration process. It's like every cell in your psychological body is getting new programming, new instructions about what matters and what doesn't, about what's worth pursuing and what's simply distraction. Your inner wisdom starts automatically rejecting anything that feels fake, forced, or purely ego-based. This includes jobs that drain your life force while paying your bills, relationships built on pretense, or codependency ambitions that serve only your image or social status. And even those carefully crafted vision boards from a few years ago when you thought you knew exactly what you wanted from life. This is why so many people describe the awakening process as simultaneously the most freeing and the most disorienting experience they've ever had. You feel liberated from patterns that never really served you, but you haven't yet learned how to navigate without the familiar reference points that used to organize your choices and priorities. You might find yourself unable to tolerate small talk that felt normal just months ago. You might lose interest in entertainment that used to captivate you. You might feel physically uncomfortable in environments that used to feel fine. Your body, mind, and spirit are all recalibrating to a new frequency, and the old world suddenly feels like it belongs to someone else. But Jung issued a crucial warning here that many modern spiritual seekers miss entirely. If we stop at this point of disillusionment, if we get stuck in the space between the old self and the new self, we can fall into what contemporary psychology calls spiritual bypassing. We convince ourselves that nothing in the material world matters because it's all just illusion anyway. We disconnect from engagement with life, float along in a kind of spiritual dissociation, and gradually numb out to the very human experience we came here to embrace and transform. Some people mistake emotional detachment for spiritual wisdom, confusing healthy non-attachment with unhealthy disengagement. They think awakening means caring about nothing when it actually means learning to care about everything from a completely different place in yourself. They confuse transcendence with avoidance, enlightenment with emotional numbness. The self that Jung understood, the authentic core of your being, wants something entirely different from ego death or spiritual bypassing. The self doesn't want to escape the world or dismiss material existence as unreal. The self wants to live fully through you, to bring what he called heaven into this human body, to express divine consciousness through the particular, unique, irreplaceable form that is your individual life. The self doesn't reject the world or dismiss earthly experience as unimportant. Instead, it completely redefines your role within the world. It transforms you from someone who takes from life to someone who gives to life, from someone who needs the world to validate them, to someone who serves the world's evolution toward greater consciousness and love. But in order to step into this new way of being, in order to discover what motivation looks like, when it comes from the soul instead of the ego, you have to pass through what Jung described as a peculiar, uncomfortable middle phase, a psychological passage that almost no one recognizes while they're actually moving through it. and that our productivity-obsessed culture has no framework for understanding, supporting, or honoring as sacred. There's a phase after awakening that almost no one talks about in spiritual circles because it's not glamorous, it doesn't photograph well for social media, and it doesn't generate thousands of likes or shares. It doesn't look like meditating on a mountaintop in Bali or writing profound quotes for Instagram stories. It doesn't resemble the glowing testimonials you see in transformation programs or the before and after success stories that fill personal development websites. Instead, it looks much more ordinary and infinitely more challenging than any of those polished presentations suggest. It looks like sitting in your living room in silence for hours, unable to explain to anyone why you can't seem to get excited about things that used to matter deeply to you. It looks like watching the world rush by at its familiar frantic pace, while you feel like you're moving through invisible water, every gesture requiring tremendous effort. It looks like having well-meaning friends and family members ask what's wrong if you're okay, whether you need to talk to someone while you struggle to articulate that nothing is wrong exactly. You're just different now in ways that don't translate easily into normal conversation. You're processing something that doesn't have a name in ordinary language. You might find yourself staring out windows more than usual, not thinking about anything in particular, just watching clouds or trees or people walking by with a kind of distant fascination. You might lose hours scrolling through your phone, not because the content is interesting, but because it fills the strange emptiness that seems to have taken up residence in your chest. Carl Jung would tell you something that might surprise you. You're not lost during this time. You're not broken or regressing or failing at spiritual development. You are precisely where you need to be. You're in between. You've successfully disidentified from the ego's demands and desires, from the constant chatter of, I want this, I need that, I should do this, I have to achieve that. But you haven't yet discovered how to live authentically from the deeper self that's trying to emerge through you. This liminal space, this psychological no man's land between who you were and who you're becoming, isn't a mistake in your development or a sign that you took a wrong turn somewhere. It's a necessary rite of passage as essential to genuine transformation as the chrysalis stage is to a butterfly's development. But our hyper-productive, always optimizing culture has absolutely no tolerance for this kind of organic stillness. In a world where every moment is supposed to be leveraged for maximum efficiency and growth, where even meditation gets turned into a productivity hack, this kind of purposeless pause gets immediately pathologized. Stillness gets misdiagnosed as depression. Natural reflection gets mistaken for rumination or anxiety. The sacred art of doing nothing, of simply being present to what is without trying to change or improve or optimize anything, gets labeled as lack of motivation, lack of drive, or worse, lack of purpose. So you end up judging yourself harshly for experiencing something that Jung considered absolutely essential for psychological health and spiritual maturity. You feel guilty for not being more productive, more directed, more enthusiastic about your goals and plans. You might even seek therapy or coaching to fix something that isn't actually broken. And that self-judgment, that internal criticism and impatience with your own organic process actually blocks the very energy your soul is trying to call back into your life. It's like interrupting someone who's trying to tell you something important because you think they're taking too long to get to the point. Jung had a specific term for this psychological phenomenon that you're experiencing. He called it enantiodromia, a concept he borrowed from ancient Greek philosophy that describes the process where things naturally flip into their opposite when they reach an extreme point. It's the psychological law of balance restoration, and the psyche's way of correcting imbalances that have gone on too long. When you awaken, when you finally see through the ego's endless demands and desires, your inner pendulum swings dramatically from ego-driven striving to soul-level stillness. You go from, I must do everything and achieve everything and prove myself constantly, to, why do anything at all when I can see how ultimately meaningless most of it is? This swing isn't random pathological or a sign that something's wrong with your spiritual development. It's exactly how psychological balance gets restored after years or decades of ego domination. The pendulum has to swing far in the opposite direction before it can find its natural center point, the place of dynamic equilibrium, where both ego and self can function in healthy collaboration. In mythology and ancient wisdom, traditions around the world, this phase has been recognized and honored for thousands of years. It's the hermit phase in the tarot, the wandering in the wilderness, that precedes revelation and the dark night of the soul, some that mystics like John of the Cross wrote about with such precision and compassion. It's the necessary descent into the underworld that appears in heroes' journey narratives across cultures. It's the moment in every authentic transformation story when everything familiar falls away and the protagonist has to discover who they really are, underneath all their roles, identities, and social conditioning. It's the death before rebirth, the dissolution before reconstitution, the emptying before filling. In biological terms, it's precisely like what happens to a caterpillar inside the chrysalis. The caterpillar doesn't just grow wings and learn to fly. It literally dissolves into undifferentiated cellular soup, breaking down completely before reorganizing itself into an entirely different kind of creature. Not a caterpillar anymore, not yet a butterfly. Just organic potential waiting to reorganize itself according to a blueprint that exists beyond conscious understanding. And here's the thing about that soup stage: it doesn't accomplish anything in the conventional sense. It doesn't have goals or 5-year plans. It doesn't hustle or network or optimize its productivity. It doesn't worry about falling behind or missing opportunities. It simply dissolves completely and trusts the mysterious intelligence of transformation to reorganize it into something more beautiful and more capable than what came before. This is where the ego absolutely panics and where most people get stuck or try to force their way back to familiar territory. The ego thrives on action, achievement, forward movement, clear identity, and definable goals. The ego wants to know what's next, wants to control the process, wants guarantees about outcomes. But the self operates by entirely different principles. The self whispers, "Let go. Stop trying to control this process. Stop trying to rush through it, or skip over it, or fix it. I'm building something much deeper and more sustainable than what came before." But it requires your complete surrender to not knowing, to not doing, to not being anyone in particular for a while. This is where most modern approaches to spirituality and personal development reveal their limitations. They teach concepts like follow your bliss, or just raise your vibration, or manifest your desires, or find your passion. And while positive intention and emotional awareness certainly matter, Carl Jung would point out that if you try to skip over the darkness, if you try to bypass the dissolution phase, you miss the gold that's hidden in the depths. Jung believed that shadow integration, the process of facing, feeling, and consciously reclaiming the repressed, uncomfortable, denied parts of yourself, is absolutely essential for becoming a psychologically mature and spiritually authentic human being. Not optional, not advanced practice, not something you can substitute with enough meditation or positive thinking or energy healing. It's the core curriculum of genuine personal development. This sacred nothingness you're experiencing, this psychological void that feels so uncomfortable and unproductive, is precisely where the unconscious finally has enough space to rise into conscious awareness. All the parts of yourself you've pushed down, ignored, tried to transcend, or attempted to heal away are asking to be seen, felt, and integrated with compassion. Your psyche, in its infinite wisdom, will deliberately stall your motivation, your drive, even your access to clarity and direction in order to force you to slow down enough to feel what you've been avoiding your entire life. It's not punishing you or making you suffer unnecessarily. It's creating the conditions necessary for real healing and authentic transformation. For those who identify as Carl Jung empath types, this process often involves not just personal shadow material, but collective shadow as well. Highly sensitive individuals frequently carry psychic material that belongs to their families, communities, and culture. The post-awakening pause becomes a time of processing not just individual psychology, but ancestral patterns, cultural conditioning, and collective unconscious material that needs conscious attention and integration. This is why the hermit phase often feels so much heavier and more complex for naturally empathic people. They're not just processing their own psychological material. They're serving as conduits for collective healing, feeling, and transforming patterns that extend far beyond their individual experience. And here's where something beautiful and unexpected begins to happen, usually so slowly that you don't notice it at first. When you finally stop resisting the void, when you quit trying to force your way back to familiar motivation and productivity, when you surrender completely to not knowing what comes next, something genuinely new starts to emerge. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or cosmic downloads or sudden clarity about your life purpose. More like dawn gradually brightening the sky so slowly that you can't pinpoint the moment when darkness becomes light. But suddenly you realize you can see things that were invisible just moments before. Jung called this the emergence of the self as a living inner compass. Not a concept you understand intellectually, but an actual guidance system that operates through feeling, intuition, body wisdom, synchronicity, and what he termed the symbolic life. This is when motivation begins to return, but it feels completely different from anything you experienced before your awakening. It's not anxious or driven or performative. It's not fueled by fear of falling behind, inadequacy, or the desperate need to prove your worth to yourself or anyone else. It's something much older and much quieter, much more trustworthy and sustainable. It's a kind of soul-led movement that feels more like remembering than chasing, more like responding to what's actually present than forcing what you think should happen, more like dancing with life than trying to dominate it. You've walked through the void now. You've felt the silence, experienced the stillness, survived the deep pause that follows genuine awakening. You've learned to tolerate not knowing, not doing, not being anyone in particular for extended periods of time. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something genuinely new is beginning to stir inside you. This isn't the old familiar urgency that used to drive your days, the anxious energy that made you feel like you were always running late for something important. This isn't the desperate need to prove yourself or accumulate achievements or climb ladders that other people built. This is something quieter and infinitely more trustworthy, something that feels like it's been waiting patiently for you to slow down enough to notice it. This isn't a lightning bolt moment or a dramatic revelation that changes everything overnight. It's more like a gentle inner pull, a subtle shift in how you relate to choice and action and possibility. You're not going back to your old life, because the person who lived that life has been fundamentally transformed. Instead, you're building something entirely new from the ground up, using materials you didn't even know existed. This is where the self begins to speak, not through words or thoughts or mental concepts, but through what Jung called resonance, through body wisdom, through the mysterious language of symbols and synchronicity and felt sense. He believed that once the ego has genuinely surrendered its dominant position and the unconscious material has been sufficiently integrated, we become capable of living from a place much deeper than personality or social conditioning or family programming. That's when existence stops being primarily about survival achievement or external validation and becomes about meaning, authenticity, service, and what Jung termed the realization of the self in everyday life. And here's something that might surprise you. It's often beautifully, profoundly ordinary. When the self leads your life, you don't hustle in the old desperate way. You respond. You're not motivated by FOMO or the anxiety of falling behind, or the fear that everyone else is figuring it out faster than you are. You're guided by what feels genuinely aligned with your deepest nature, what resonates in your body and soul, rather than what looks good on paper or sounds impressive to other people. You no longer chase clarity like it's something you can capture and possess through the right workshop or book or guru. Instead, you recognize clarity when it naturally arises, and you trust it even when you can't explain it rationally or defend it to skeptics. You learn to distinguish between mental clarity, which is often just sophisticated confusion, and soul clarity, which feels more like remembering something you've always known. Living from this place doesn't mean you'll always feel motivated in the conventional sense that personal development culture promotes. You might still experience waves of fatigue, confusion, grief, or uncertainty. That's simply part of being a sensitive human in a complex world. But what you won't feel anymore is that constant sense of inner betrayal, that exhausting experience of dragging yourself through a life that fundamentally doesn't fit who you really are. Instead, you might start to notice that you're naturally drawn to create things even when no one is watching or applauding. You find yourself saying no to opportunities that look impressive on paper but feel hollow in your body. You begin following your authentic curiosity rather than your strategic checklist. You choose inner peace over external performance again and again, because it's no longer a choice you have to think about consciously. It becomes as automatic as breathing. This is the new fuel source, and it's completely different from anything that powered your life before awakening. It's not adrenaline or anxiety or the desperate need to prove your worth or keep up with everyone else. It's alignment. Jung called this living symbolically, which doesn't mean living in fantasy or spiritual bypassing, but living with soul awareness, where you begin to trust your inner imagery, your dreams, your synchronicities, and your gut feelings as legitimate forms of guidance. For those who identify as Carl Jung empath types, this transition often involves learning to use their natural sensitivity as a spiritual compass rather than a burden to manage or weakness to overcome. Instead of being overwhelmed by the emotions and energies around them, they discover how to read these subtle currents as valuable information about what's authentic and what's pretense, what's life-giving and what's draining, what serves growth and what perpetuates stagnation. Empaths in this phase often discover that their sensitivity was never a problem to be solved. It was always a gift, waiting to be understood and utilized consciously. They learn to trust their body's wisdom, their emotional intelligence, their intuitive knowing about people and situations, rather than constantly second-guessing themselves or trying to think their way through decisions that are better felt than analyzed. So what does this soul-led way of living actually look like in everyday practical terms? Sometimes it's as simple as learning to ask entirely different questions. Instead of, "What should I do to get ahead?" you ask, "What's quietly calling to me right now?" Instead of, "What's my 5-year plan?" you ask, "Where is life gently nudging me in this moment?" Instead of, "How can I prove myself or achieve more?" you ask, "What feels most honest and true given what's actually happening?" You begin to participate with life rather than trying to dominate control or force it into predetermined shapes. You start to trust that your authentic response to what's actually present is more valuable than your perfect strategy for what might happen. You learn to dance with uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it through planning and analysis. This doesn't mean abandoning all ambition, discipline, or intelligent planning. It means transforming these energies, entirely upgrading them from ego-based to soul-based functioning. Ambition becomes devotion to truth, to growth, to service, rather than self-aggrandizement. Discipline becomes the practice of staying aligned with your deeper knowing, rather than forcing yourself to meet external expectations that don't actually serve anyone. Planning becomes a creative dialogue with possibility rather than an attempt to control outcomes. Goals become expressions of your authentic nature, rather than attempts to prove your worth or impress other people. Work becomes a form of creative expression and service, rather than just a way to pay bills or build status. The irony is that this soul-powered way of engaging with life often gets things done far more effectively than ego-driven hustle ever could. Projects flow more easily, relationships deepen naturally, creative inspiration becomes more consistent and reliable. But now it's sustainable, because it's not burning through your life force or requiring you to betray yourself to maintain momentum. Now it's generative, because it's connected to the inexhaustible creative energy of the self. This is what Jung meant by individuation in its mature form. Not just becoming conscious of your psychological patterns and spiritual insights, but actually learning to live from the place of wholeness rather than fragmentation, integration rather than division, authenticity rather than performance. It's what personal development looks like when the soul takes the lead instead of the ego calling all the shots. You might find yourself naturally drawn to work that serves something larger than personal success or financial accumulation. You might discover creative expressions you never knew were dormant in you, talents and interests that emerge organically when you're not forcing yourself to be productive in conventional ways. You might develop the capacity to hold space for other people's pain without trying to fix it or taking it on as your own emotional burden. You might become someone who can remain centered in chaos, not because you're detached or spiritually bypassing, but because you're connected to something unshakable inside yourself. You might find that you naturally inspire other people simply by being authentic, without trying to be inspiring or having a message to deliver. For Carl Jung empath individuals, this phase often manifests as the ability to feel deeply, without being destroyed by feeling to care profoundly, without losing themselves in other people's experiences and problems to serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious worlds, in ways that heal both themselves and others. The motivation that emerges from this integrated place has a completely different quality than anything you experienced before. It's not desperate or performative or anxious. It doesn't need external validation to sustain itself. It doesn't collapse when criticized or ignored. It arises naturally from the deep satisfaction of expressing what's most true in you, from the joy of living in integrity with your authentic nature rather than trying to be someone you're not. This is the self's motivation system, not to impress or achieve or accumulate or compete, but to express the unique gift that only you can bring to the world in your own particular way. And it often leads you to create, serve, heal, teach, build, and contribute in ways you never could have planned or forced, not because you think you should, or because someone told you it was your purpose, but because your entire being naturally says yes to certain forms of expression and service. If you've been feeling like your spark disappeared after awakening, if you've been worried that something's wrong with you because you can't seem to care about the things that used to drive you, I want you to understand something that might change how you see this entire journey. Your spark didn't disappear. It wasn't lost or damaged or diminished. The old fire burned down completely so that you could discover a deeper flame, one that doesn't flicker when external circumstances change, one that doesn't depend on other people's approval or society's definitions of success to keep burning brightly, one that draws its fuel from an inexhaustible source within you, rather than from the validation, achievement, and recognition that the external world may or may not provide. Carl Jung didn't promise that this path of individuation would be easy, comfortable, or socially acceptable. He understood that genuine transformation requires us to release our grip on who we think we're supposed to be in order to discover who we actually are, underneath all the conditioning, expectations, and identities we've accumulated. And if you're here listening to these words, recognizing yourself in this description of the post-awakening journey, then you're already walking this path, whether you fully realize it or not. The goal was never to get your old motivation back, to return to the driven, anxious, externally focused way of living that characterized your pre-awakening existence. The old motivation was powered by incompleteness, by the ego's endless hunger to fill a void that could never truly be satisfied through external means. It was fueled by the unconscious belief that you were not enough as you are, that your worth had to be earned through achievement, that your value depended on how well you performed in the eyes of others. The new motivation that's emerging in you is rooted in something entirely different. Wholeness rather than neediness, completion rather than lack expression, rather than impression service, rather than self-aggrandizement, authenticity, rather than performance. It comes from a place of already being enough, already being valuable, already being worthy of love and respect simply because you exist. This transformation creates a fundamentally different relationship with what our culture calls success and achievement. When you live from the self, success becomes defined as alignment with your authentic nature, rather than accumulation of external markers like money, status, recognition, or power. Achievement becomes about expressing your unique gifts and contributing to the collective well-being rather than proving your worth or superiority to a world that may not even understand what you're offering. You're not becoming someone who doesn't care about anything or anyone. You're becoming someone who cares about everything from a place of love rather than fear, from abundance rather than scarcity, from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from service rather than selfishness. You're learning to care without attachment to give, without expectation to create, without needing specific outcomes. The identity that's emerging through this process is simultaneously more humble and more powerful than what came before. More humble because you're no longer trying to be special, exceptional, or better than others. You're not competing or comparing or trying to prove anything. More powerful because you're connected to the inexhaustible creative force that Jung recognized as the true source of human vitality, purpose, and meaning. You're transitioning from being a performer, trying to earn applause, to being an authentic expressionist who creates from joy. From being a seeker, always looking for the next insight, experience, or teacher, to being an embodier of the wisdom you've already discovered. From a constant state of anxious doing driven by fear and inadequacy, to a natural state of peaceful being that generates appropriate action when needed. This is what sustainable soul power actually looks like in practice. It's motivation that doesn't burn out because it's not consuming your life force or requiring you to betray yourself to maintain momentum. It's ambition that serves life rather than just serving the ego's need for validation. It's success redefined as the courage to be genuinely yourself in a world that's constantly trying to make you into someone else. The journey of individuation, as Jung understood it, is never really finished. It's not a destination you arrive at and then coast through the rest of your life in permanent enlightenment. Awakening isn't a static achievement, but the beginning of a dynamic, ongoing relationship with growth consciousness and authentic self-expression. There will be new challenges to meet from this more integrated place, deeper layers of conditioning to explore and transform, more sophisticated ways to express your authentic nature as you continue growing and evolving, new opportunities to serve life through your particular gifts and perspective. But you'll meet these future challenges from a completely different foundation than before. You'll have learned to trust the process of transformation rather than fighting it or trying to control it. You'll have developed the capacity to find meaning and purpose even in periods of uncertainty, change, and apparent setbacks. You'll have discovered that your worth isn't dependent on your productivity achievements or how well you fit into other people's expectations of who you should be. Personal development from this soul-centered perspective becomes less about fixing what's wrong with you and more about allowing what's most true in you to emerge and express itself fully. It becomes less about following someone else's formula for success and more about discovering and honoring your own unique path. Less about becoming someone different and more about remembering who you've always been beneath all the layers of conditioning and expectation. For those who resonate with the Carl Jung empath perspective, this often means learning to see their sensitivity not as something to overcome, manage, or apologize for, but as a profound gift that allows them to serve as bridges between different levels of consciousness. Empaths in this integrated phase become natural healers, teachers, and guides for others who are navigating their own awakening process. They learn to use their sensitivity to read the subtle currents of emotion, energy, and unconscious material that most people miss entirely. They become skilled at holding space for transformation, at seeing through people's personas to their authentic self, at sensing what wants to emerge in any given situation or relationship. Your old motivation didn't disappear because you failed at spirituality or personal development. It evolved because you succeeded beyond your old understanding of what success could mean. You're not broken or damaged or regressing. You're upgraded in ways that our culture doesn't have adequate language for yet. You're not lost. You're found perhaps for the first time in your life. The emptiness you experienced during the void phase wasn't a problem to be solved or a mistake to be corrected. It was a sacred clearing, a necessary space that had to be created so that something infinitely more authentic and sustainable could take root and grow. It was the fertile darkness that all genuine transformation requires. This isn't the end of your awakening story. This is where your real story begins. The story of what it means to live as a whole human being in a fragmented world. The story of what becomes possible when someone stops trying to be who they think they should be and starts expressing who they actually are. The story of how one person's commitment to authenticity creates ripples of permission for others to do the same. You're part of a growing number of people who are pioneering a new way of being human, a way that honors both the spiritual and psychological dimensions of existence. A way that integrates ancient wisdom with modern understanding. A way that doesn't choose between transcendence and engagement, but finds a path to embody both simultaneously. If this journey has felt isolating at times, know that you're not alone. There are others walking this path. Others who understand the unique challenges and gifts of post-awakening life. The community you're looking for is forming around you, drawn together, not by shared beliefs or ideologies, but by authenticity depth and the commitment to living from truth rather than pretense. And if something in these words has resonated with your own experience, if it's helped you recognize and name something you've been feeling but couldn't quite articulate, then you're already contributing to this emerging community of conscious individuals who are learning to live from the self rather than from the ego's endless demands and distractions. Your awakening isn't a personal achievement to be celebrated in isolation or used to feel superior to others who haven't had similar experiences. It's a gift that naturally wants to be shared not through preaching or teaching in the conventional sense, but through the simple, radical act of being genuinely yourself in a world that desperately needs examples of what authentic humanity actually looks like. This is your invitation to trust the process that's already underway in your life, to honor the wisdom of your own soul's timing, and to allow yourself to become who you've always been, underneath all the layers of conditioning, trauma, and societal programming. To stop trying to be someone else's version of enlightened or successful or spiritual, and start expressing your own unique flavor of consciousness and creativity. The world needs what you have to offer, not as a perfected guru or enlightened teacher with all the answers, but as a fellow human being who has learned to live from love instead of fear, from wholeness instead of fragmentation, from authenticity instead of performance. Someone who demonstrates through their very being that it's possible to be fully human and fully conscious simultaneously. Your becoming is just beginning. The person you're growing into, the gifts you're developing, the ways you'll serve life through your authentic expression, it's all still emerging. And it's exactly what the world has been waiting for, even if the world doesn't know how to name or recognize what you represent yet. The post-awakening path isn't about returning to who you were before. It's about discovering who you've always been beneath everything that was never really you. And that discovery, that remembering that coming home to yourself is perhaps the greatest gift you can give to yourself and to the collective human family. If this exploration has touched something true in your own journey, if it's helped you understand your experience in a new way, I'd love to hear about what you're discovering. What has the post-awakening path felt like for you? How are you learning to trust your own process of transformation? What's emerging in your life as you learn to live from the self rather than the ego? And if you're hungry for more content that explores these deeper dimensions of psychological and spiritual development, that honors both the challenges and the gifts of conscious living, I invite you to subscribe and join our community of fellow travelers. Because your awakening story matters, your questions and insights matter. And your unique perspective on this journey adds something essential to our collective understanding of what it means to become fully human. Remember, you're not trying to get back to who you used to be. You're discovering who you've always been beneath everything that was conditioning, trauma, and social programming. And that discovery is perhaps the greatest adventure available to a human being. Your real life is just beginning.